Hello and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. This week we're going to take a hard look at what the government calls a major structural reform, bringing public schemes and projects under a monitorable output-outcome framework. The key words are two, monitorable and outcome. So far, financial outlays of the schemes of ministries were indicated in the budget documents, and while the expected outputs and outcomes of the schemes were prepared and presented separately by each ministry. But from this budget onwards, the outlays, outputs and outcomes have been presented to the Parliament in measurable terms, bringing in greater accountability for the agencies involved in the execution of government schemes and projects. While the term outlay is relatively easy to understand, it's the amount of money provided for each scheme or project in the budget. The distinction between output and outcome is a little more difficult. Output, according to the Finance Ministry document on the subject, refers to the direct and measurable product of program activities, often expressed in physical terms or units. Outcomes, in contrast, are the collective results or the qualitative improvements brought about in the delivery of these services, often expressed in terms of improvements over the ex-ante or earlier indicators and benchmarks. Now that's all from the government document, and if that's not jargon, I don't know what is. Which is why I have got two of our topmost macroeconomics, Ratan Roy, Director NIPFP, and Arvind Virmani, former CEA, Government of India, and India's former representative to the IMF, to try and de-jargonize it all for our viewers, and most importantly of all, tell us, what does it really mean? Does it make governments more accountable? Welcome to the show, Ratan and Arvind. Let me start with you, Ratan. Starting with the 17-18 budget, the government has put out the output and the outcome schemes of 68 ministries and departments, along with the financial outlays as part of the budget documents, so that clearly defined objectives and goals for each of the schemes can be seen by all. The government calls this a significant departure from the past, as it presents A, the financial outlay for the year, along with B, the output and the deliverables, and C, the projected medium-term outcome of each project or scheme in a single consolidated document. This, says the government, will significantly enhance transparency, predictability and ease of understanding the government's development agenda. So my question to you, Ratan, is, does all this information, making it available in a single document, really improve monitorability and, more importantly, accountability, Ratan?
Well, I think it's a very good idea that government tell us what outlays are being used to produce what kinds of outputs. This information is normally available internally in the budget documentation after the budget circular is passed, when ministries sort of, bid either to continue schemes or start new ones. So to that extent, specifying what the purpose of different objects of government expenditure are is a very good thing. It certainly improves transparency. Now, accountability will depend on who uses this information. Other than people like NIPFP and researchers, you'll have to trawl through a fairly formidable set of documents to actually monitor whether government was achieving the outputs it was achieving or not. In addition to that, and we'll come to this later, the specification of medium-term outcomes tends to be, shall we say, very central plan-like. But, something is better than nothing. It's a good start.
Okay, something is better than nothing, but Arvind, do you agree with Ratan's assessment? As his chief economic advisor, did you at any time toy with a similar idea? For the fact is that the focus is usually only on outlays and the fiscal deficit. But the very purpose of government raising resources and spending it is to achieve certain objectives or goals. However, almost no attention is paid to this aspect. It is also true that in itself, output is a very poor measure. For instance, a road might have been built, but if the whole purpose of building the road was to enable access to markets, that should be far more important. But today we really don't know if that has happened at all. Arvind?
Yeah, so there are many questions in your question. So let me start with, was it considered? I think we've been talking about it for at least a decade, if I remember correctly. This promise has been made many times. That's the first point. The second point is that it's useful to think of projects versus programs a little separately. Each project, in a sense, when you do a project appraisal, has some of these things within it. So it will say, okay, we will assign so much money and this will help build so many houses for so many people. So that output was always there, and I agree with Ratan that it's useful to have it summarized in one place so that people can check, especially outsiders, generally people who comment, I think always like to have it in a summary place. Nobody is going to go through in detail, except for the experts. So in that sense, it's useful to have something which was there always out and easily available to outsiders who can then check. The third point relating to outcomes, to some extent also it applies to projects, but much more to programs. And again, I'll start with that housing point, but as I said, it applies more to programs. So the question is, you are building certain houses, but people are also building. So what is the marginal contribution to the outcome? Let's say our broader purpose is that everybody has houses, but you are not the only one contributing to this, and particularly if you go to a broader issue like poverty alleviation, So there are things happening in the economy, economic growth, etc., job creation, and then you say, okay, I've got a poverty alleviation program. How much poverty have I alleviated? That's a much more difficult question. It's a question of marginal contribution. But again, I agree with Ratin that, yeah, it's a start. We can't get to the final goal instantaneously, but that in some ways that should be the goal, and maybe having these things on the table will make us kind of strive to improve them.
Oh, so yes, it certainly is a start. It is a beginning. But Ratin, at a time when there is so much controversy even over output, which is something that is relatively easy to measure. Look at the never-ending debate or dispute over the GDP numbers. Can we really ever hope to have agreement on outcomes, which are essentially qualitative? Who is to say, for instance, whether there has been an improvement in delivery of government services? Won't such judgments invariably be hostage to political economy considerations? Take something like Manrega. Has Manrega been a success? Do you ever see agreement on a question like that, Ratin?
Well, to be fair, if you look at I'm quite lazy, so I looked at the first demand in this year's output outcome framework, agriculture. Clearly here, the way it happens, the individual departments provide this output, and it's collated by the top bureaucrats in agriculture. You will find that the medium-term outcomes are actually quantified. Now, you may disagree with the quantification, but it's a good idea. There's a larger problem. I'll come to that in a minute. So, for example, the interest subsidy for short-term credit to farmers, there's an output there, which is how much you will subsidize crop loans by. And then they say the outcome it will create is annual growth in food grain productivity at 2%, compound annual growth rate of agriculture. Now, this is useful because, first there is, as Arvind very rightly said, the problem of allocating this particular expenditure to that output. In some cases, you can. For example, in housing, you can say that if you build more housing, then the housing stock goes up. But whether the agriculture growth rate goes up as a consequence of the interest subsidy or not, it might go up in spite of the interest subsidy. It might go up because of the interest subsidy. We don't know the counterfactual. That is difficult. But that being said, most of the outcomes in the agriculture section are actually quantified, bar one really vague one, which has to do with the improvement of agricultural statistics scheme, which purports to provide an output of area estimates under principal crops of Kharif and Rabi season, and it says cropping scenario and likely production of the country will be the outcome. Now, that's exactly what pad outcome budgeting is. What you would normally expect if you wanted these quantifications to make sense is two things, one of which we stoutly refuse to do, which is a detailed medium-term expenditure framework within which these things can be contextual in a multi-year period. The second would be a strategic analysis by the ministry prior to the budget of the kinds of things that will bring about a multidimensional outcome, for example, a 2% compound annual growth rate in agricultural output. If you have that strategic framework, then you can say, well, these interventions which cost this much and yield these outputs will contribute to this extent to this outcome, and then you're able to monitor. But without those two things in place, what you effectively get is a slightly more refined version of central planning.
Ratin believes that most outputs and outcomes also can be measured, but Arvind, outcomes ultimately must be measured against objectives. But is there really unanimity even when it comes to objectives? Take the case for Manrega, which I raised the same issue with Ratin. Is its objective merely poverty alleviation, giving jobs, or should success also be measured in terms of whether it has succeeded in creating assets? Again, even when you have a large number of people on the Manrega rolls, there are also many anecdotal stories, and some audit also of Manrega which shows there are ghost rolls, the beneficiaries don't get their dues. So my question again to you is that in trying to measure outcomes, are we really attempting something that is close to impossible, Arvind?
Right. So there are two aspects. One is if there is a single goal, and perhaps this will help us think about it, because and second is multiple goals, like you said. So let's take the single goal one, for example, agriculture. If the goal is to change the rate of growth of agriculture, you do many things. You know, you give fertilizer subsidy, you give interest subsidy, X, Y, Z, so many different things. So what an outcome framework can in principle help you do is to focus your mind on which is contributing more and which is contributing less to growth. I think in my way of thinking, if it forces you to give, you know, to estimate, at least to start thinking that are we really, is this item really helping you achieve the goals, or is that one better and this one is less so, etc. So that is one aspect. Again, as I said, it's not that you will measure the outcome and you know exactly what is the marginal contribution, but it may force you, you meaning everybody involved, including observers like us and you, the media, to force us to think, is X contributing more or X is not contributing to that ultimate goal. So that is when the goal is clear and single. The second point you made about Manrega, which is now beginning to have multiple goals, right? So giving employment, creating assets, etc. Now traditionally, multiple goals have always been an excuse to avoid accountability. Okay. Because if X, you know, you have two goals A and B, you always say, oh, we have a third goal C, okay, we have A is not achieved, but B is achieved, you know, and passing the buck. So again, you know, it's not that you will suddenly achieve these goals or you will be very clear, but again we will start asking these questions, that should you really have multiple goals? Is there any way of knowing how much each is contributing to what, or are we just spending and wasting money because of vested interests and because we've always spent this money? So it's the questions and the thinking which it could give rise to is what I would commend on it. It's not, I mean, all those problems which you have mentioned will remain, yes. Okay. But I think the process of thinking through and of questioning will improve decision making.
Well, absolutely. The moment we start questioning government, that is the beginning of holding governments accountable. But I'm afraid on that note, it's time for us to slip into a very short break. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the government's move to have the outcome budget into more prominence by bringing outcomes, outlays, as well as outputs all in a single document. And I'm in discussion with Ratan Roy and Arvind Vimrani, and both my expertise so far are much more hopeful than I am that this is a good start. But Ratan, for all that we economists might urge the government not to allow economics to be held hostage to politics, in a democracy, and more so in a poor democracy, budgetary decision-making has political underpinnings for which the role of political concerns and value judgments cannot be consigned to the background. So how do we square the circle on that? Whenever we look at outcomes, can we really divorce it from whatever our political ideology leanings are, Ratan?
No, of course not. I mean, outcome budgets are perfectly compatible with political ideology. It all it does is it imposes a discipline on you, and it shows that you're doing what you said you have done. If your political ideology is to increase, is to give preference to agriculture and housing, and not to give preference to something else, then an outcome budget, by showing relative emphasis, in fact, a budget shows what you're doing. So I don't think there's any sort of detraction or issue with political ideology.
Arvind, would outcome budgeting be more of a success if it were to go hand in hand with some kind of an institutional arrangement, like say the establishment of a body like the US Congressional Budget Office that is both independent and also has the resources to track government's budget promises? Today the fact is that in India we have either the government's word in the outcome or output, and maybe some independent researcher, and the government will always give you a favorable opinion, and the latter, the independent researcher, might not have the resources or may not be free of personal bias. So how do we really track what government says? If this is the output, this is the outcome, more importantly, how do we ensure that the outcome is a dispassionate assessment of what government has done?
So one is the traditional method we use. As I said, experts or whoever is interested in the subject now has it black and white right in front and can investigate. But I think your suggestion is a good one. In principle, having a body, you know, if you recall, when we had the planning commission, there was a process, in fact it was set up, evaluation office, was set up, that for 50 years Planning Commission has claimed all kinds of things. Is any of this really true? Is it happening, or is it just a claim? So there was the evaluation office set up. Of course, then the Planning Commission was abolished, so that didn't work. But you're right, in principle, what you're suggesting is a good idea. The Parliament has parliamentary standing committees, etc. If in their wisdom they decide they need a technical input, who would do analysis and provide this input, yeah, in principle it's a good idea.
Ratan, would you agree with Arvind that in principle it's a good idea, and would you agree there is a case for an independent body to hold the government to its promises? Today, of course, we have the CAG, but that looks at government spending, and typically it looks at whether the spending has been as per the rules and is not really concerned with output and even less with outcomes. The FRBM committee has reportedly suggested fiscal council. Would that make sense, and how should we, what should the composition of the fiscal council be? Independent experts, parliamentarians, across party lines? How should it be?
Well, I can't comment on the FRBM committee report because the government has not yet made it public and I was a member about the fiscal council. But I think, I think there are three stages to this. The first stage is that ultimately government's accountable to the people. So if you claim bombastically that you're building roads and railways, etc., and you fail in a major way or in particular pockets, then hopefully that will translate into you're being punished by the electorate. So that's the best accountability you can have in a democracy. At the second stage, what you have is essentially accountability to make sure that execution failures are being highlighted and policy failures are being highlighted. That's where I think the experts come in, and in that context, some kind of technical oversight, evidence-based oversight of what claims governments make in their budgetary process is a good idea. But that is, of course, goes well beyond an outcome budget. That's that's an institutional reform. What an outcome budget essentially does is enables you to make sure, and you can see this in this current outcome budget, the extent to which when government makes a claim, that claim is credibly matched by A, resources, and B, by what the projected outcome is. Take an example of the Ministry of Railways. It is clear to me for the Ministry of Railways that there is no overall medium-term outcome envisaged by the railways. The entire outcome budget of the railways, numbers 5 and 6 are blank in terms of outcomes, is quantified in terms of new lines, how many kilometers and where they'll be built.
Right.
This tells me potentially that what the railways is adopting in India is a piecemeal strategy of railway expansion and maintenance. I do not see a strategic framework here. In agriculture, you begin to see a semblance of a strategic framework because they're arguing specifically about increasing agricultural growth, agricultural productivity, and improving the quality of research and extension. So I can draw that sort of judgment from an outcome budget. But the process you're asking for is one step up and requires changes in institutional architecture, medium-term budgeting, strategic analysis of what government will do in the medium term in areas ranging from defense to agriculture to railways, and then budgeting in conformance with that. We don't have those two other meta elements yet in place, since we are still doing annual budgeting, and I do not see a strategic framework emerging at this time. Perhaps that will, with the 15-year vision and the 7-year strategy and all that sort of thing. So I think just to context that is where an outcome budget is useful. It is not a meta document that's going to sort of create transformational processes in the governance architecture.
That's true. It will take time, but Arvind, at a time when Indian government budgets are not really known for their accuracy, and we're talking about output and outcome budgets, because the fact is that till recently, in fact, the RBI used to bemoan the absence of what it called fiscal marksmanship. It said there was no fiscal marksmanship. And the fact is that there are wide differences between the budget and the revised estimates, and even more between these and the actual numbers when they come in 2 years later, by which time everybody's forgotten. In such a scenario, doesn't this virtually defeat the purpose of an outcome budgeting, because we're not even able to do the basics right? Arvind?
No, I think you're mixing up, macro and micro. So, but it does raise one issue. Outcome question is how broadly do you define an outcome? Of course, the traditional project appraisal used to be, when it started 50, 60 years ago, it was about social benefit cost analysis, the argument was that profitability or private benefit cost is not enough, you have to have a social element in it. Well, in my decades in Planning Commission, I never really saw a good, respectable social benefit cost analysis. So, in some sense, if we gradually move towards that in every area where we spend money, because you have to define again outcome. Remember, outcome is what? We just mentioned railways. Is it the profitability of the railways? Is it the safety, which then becomes social in some sense because we don't have liability laws, because otherwise it would come into profitability. So all these kinds of issues will be raised and will over time get sorted out, and that's the sense in which I said a start. It sets in motion a process of thinking about certain issues, questioning them, and then improving them. So the railways at some point will have to define, two elements. Let's say one profitability, one safety, one something else which they think is important, and it will be very different from what it was 50 years ago. For example, access. Access is not question of only railways. Access depends on whether there's a road, there's road transport, there is an airfield. So again, hopefully now that there is this blank space in the railways, in a year or two they will come up with something to fill it, and then people will criticize and discuss and hopefully improve over time.
Yes, it certainly is. There's a huge scope for improvement, mainly because it's so nebulous at the moment. But Ratan, Arvind raised a very important point about the social cost benefit analysis. If you were to talk in terms of outcomes, take for instance something like the Sardar Sarovar Dam. If you ask Medha Patkar, she will tell you that the social cost benefit was very adverse. The social cost was much more than the benefit. So how does one really arrive at an outcome that at least most people agree was a desirable outcome and that has been achieved? Because as I said, there is a social, because the word is social. Arvind used the word social. And how does one really ever estimate that? Is it not very, very difficult? And will it not be very contentious, whatever you say, Ratan?
Well, let's take the example of that dam.
Okay.
If the intention in building that dam was to improve the sort of net sown area under irrigation to provide drinking water and hydroelectricity by the government, then if the government provides that information in terms of outputs and outcomes, that is useful. In any democracy, then that particular strategy will be contested because there are externalities which sort of might lead to people disagreeing with the project, notwithstanding its objectives. So what an outcome budget does is it tells you whether the intended outcomes, or a good outcome budget, I don't think ours does it yet, that the statement of intended outcomes, that is outcomes intended by the government, whether progress is being made to those or not with the application of resources and the delivery and the production of outputs. Okay. Another good example would be agriculture. If agricultural growth goes up by 2%, that may lead to, I don't know, arsenic poisoning, sort of saline issues, environmental issues, but that was not the sort of intention of the project. So the project only tells you whether the government is doing what it set out to do. The wider political debate on whether government ought to be doing what it is doing, obviously the outcome budget is not helpful with.
Okay, so there are issues with outcome budget. It's not an easy thing at all. But Arvind, another problem really is that supplementary demands for grants have become very routine in the Indian context, which means that the outlay that you indicated at the time of the budget presentation might change, and often does. Now, will this not pose an additional problem when you're trying to measure the outcome, because you're looking at financial outlays, and then at the beginning of the year, this is what the financial outlay was, and this was what the outcome was expected to be. And now suddenly, halfway through the year, you change your outlay. So will that not create an additional problem, Arvind?
No, that's the problem in a way it's trying to solve, because everybody who doesn't achieve their objectives will say, oh, we didn't get enough money, or we got it too late. Now it will have to be explicitly justified and be out in the open again, and open to scrutiny. So a large element of this is transparency, which we repeatedly emphasize, but perhaps needs to be said again. The question is to be able then to quantify it. You say, okay, I got this money 3 months late, or I got half of it. Did I achieve half my objectives, or I achieved 1/10 of them, or what? We will discuss, and presumably all this discussion and transparency puts pressure on these same people next time, both those who are allocating and releasing the money, and on those who are using it, that don't use empty excuses if that's what the purpose was. If they were genuine, okay, then where is the responsibility? So again, as I said, a lot of the advantage, and that depends on how we utilize it, both you and us, I mean both experts and media, to kind of, and the political process, to assign responsibility and force the correct people to improve rather than everybody passing the buck.
Okay, Ratan, can I draw you in very quickly on that? Whether supplementary demands for grants will really impact the kind of analysis you do?
Well, the supplementary demand for grants should be as minimal as possible, and it is
Okay,
hoped
that
that the
is
change
true.
in the budget year and the delivery of these output processes, Arvind is saying that we will see a declining trend in the supplementary demand for grants. But you see, the trouble is that you're looking at it intra-year again. These things are effective when you have a medium-term expenditure framework. And when you have a medium-term expenditure framework, the question of supplementary demand for grants does not arise at all. It's a different budget-making process, and that is really what we need to move to. But regrettably, we don't seem to be doing that.
Absolutely, but I'm afraid we've run out of time completely, so I'll have to end this discussion now. Many thanks, Ratan and Arvind, for joining me in the discussion and helping to distill the meaning of an outcome budget for our viewers. Fiscal discipline is important, but getting value for money from public taxpayer money is even more crucial. And as long as outcome budgeting helps us to do a better job on that front, it is certainly worth pursuing. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. In the meantime, if there's any other subject that you'd like discussed threadbare on this program, do mail us at the mail ID you see at the bottom of your screen. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.